Over 11 years, as I was reflecting, I realised that there were two experiences that really stood out for me in my memory as my perhaps favourite experiences. And ironically, Jonathan Green of the ABC has supplied both of them. So one Sunday morning, which was also my birthday, at 7:30 a.m, I got up, walked to the ABC studios and talked about Thomas Piketty's book Capital for about 20 minutes on Radio National, which may not be everybody's idea of the perfect birthday present, but it was definitely mine. And then on another occasion, Jonathan asked my wife, Rebecca Coates, who's here today, and I to talk on air about our large gardening opportunity near Granton. I'm pleased to say it's still there on the ABC archives, and indeed if you Google John Daley and Rebecca Coates simultaneously, it's about the only thing that comes up. Given that we have not yet written our definitive piece on the way that regional art galleries can contribute to regional development. So for those of you here who do know me well, and I think that's probably everyone, and as Alex has already talked about, we grow vegetables. And some, but not everyone here, would know that I recently announced a Grattan competition for the most innovative dish that could be produced using oversized zucchini, a test so difficult that it has not yet featured on MasterChef, although Clara's working on that one. But given the otherwise suppressed competitive instincts of Granton Staff, the challenge did succeed in disposing of a large quantity of otherwise completely inedible zucchini. You might also know that on this property near Granton that Alex has spoken about, we have planted a lot of trees. And that property was more or less denuded when we started and when we owned it, when we bought it about 16 years ago. And our plantings since then reflect what Noel Pearson has described as the three cultures of Australia: Indigenous, English, and multicultural. So there are now hundreds of eucalypts and wattles, red, yellow, grey box, river red gums, messmate, swamp gums, silver and black wattles, blackwoods, and prickly moses. These are all old plants, and they endure, a bit like Australia's Indigenous culture. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land where this function is happening tonight, at least the people who are here in person, and recognise their history, culture and contributions to Australia. But as well as those Indigenous plants, we've also planted, as Alex said, dozens, I'd love to say hundreds, but I think it's probably only dozens, of oak trees. Now, many people, as soon as you say oak, think of English oaks. That's Quercus robusta for the nerds amongst us. Many people think of English oaks as indeed the essence of the United Kingdom. And it's no coincidence that the House of Commons is itself lined with oak. It's a hardwood. It endures. And a little bit like the governance institutions of the United Kingdom, English oaks have transplanted remarkably well to Australia. Their taproots go the whole way down to the water table. They will go through solid basalt because they have. And a 100-year oak that's just over the edge of our property remained bright green throughout the entirety of the millennial drought. Like the UK institutions that we use for our governance, they often protect people from the harshness of what the world can throw at us, whether that's fire or sun or unpleasant weather. And for many years, we've been planting a lot of other kinds of oaks from all over the world. Scarlet, gall and cork oaks from Europe, daimyo and Chinese cork oaks from Asia, Californian live oaks and white oaks from North America, Algerian oaks from Africa. So far, I'm afraid we only have a fraction of 600 species that grow worldwide, but I have a lot of birthdays left, and the collection is growing, much like the multicultural society that's so much part of what Australia is. Unfortunately, of course, planting trees can be pretty frustrating. They get transplant shock. In our case, at least, they get eaten by hares and kangaroos. They die off in a hot summer and they die off in a winter frost. On the other hand, there are a few things that are as satisfying as planting a tree once it gets going. The oaks that we planted 11 years ago, in the year that I started at Grattan, are now 4 or 5 times taller than I am. And they've got about 500 years to go before they more or less hit maturity. And for me, that has been the most satisfying and is the most satisfying thing about Grattan. It's already a tree much bigger than I am, and I expect it's going to keep growing for a lot longer as well. That's in the nature of good institutions. As Alex said, I actually started my life as a constitutional lawyer, and those of you who've worked with me at Grattan know that I like nothing more than realising that there might actually be a constitutional law angle to whatever problem we are working on. But the most deep-seated belief that I've got out of that background is that we are a government of laws, not of people. And that government of laws, of institutions, is a better way to live. And 6 months of COVID-19 have just provided a pretty brutal global tutorial to show just how much good government matters, not just to living better, but to living at all. Now, good government isn't purely democratic. Good government depends on expert institutions that interact with democratically elected representatives to produce outcomes better than either would produce alone. Grattan is one of those highly undemocratic institutions that helps our democratic institutions do better. At their best, institutions like Grattan have norms and a life bigger than any one individual who works for them. But of course, in the end, they are no more than the results of the efforts of those who do work there, and that's all of you. But of course, we are also part of a democracy, and it's always been part of my fundamental belief at Grattan that part of our job is talking to the public and bringing them along, and hopefully that way getting change at least some of the time. So those are the institutions that we're part of. The other thing about a garden, of course, is it has an owner. But of course, owning a garden, or for that matter, governing an institution, is a bit of an illusion. One likes to think that one is responsible for its success, but it's not really true. The growing gets done by the plants, and the hard work is done by the gardeners, and the owners get to kind of look good in the photographs. But on the other hand, no owners, no vision, no garden. So I'd like to thank the past and current board of Grattan for creating the garden in which we could plant the Grattan tree. I spoke at Grattan's launch and at the 10th anniversary about some of the Grattan history, so I'm not going to go through all of it again today. But they do say that the trick to a good tree is to plant a $5 tree in a $50 hole. Well, it wouldn't be here today, and we all wouldn't be here today, if the board hadn't set up Grattan well and made the very brave decision to hire an inaugural chief executive who hadn't worked in government for at least 10 years before they hired me. Now, as the owners of Grattan, the board has been very wise in knowing that dictating outcomes rarely works. If you try to grow a tree to fit the shape dictated in advance, you get very small, very slow-growing bonsai. And at the risk of committing botanical heresy, it's never been my favourite kind of tree. Running the institution just to keep governments happy is ultimately a recipe for a very weak tree that's going to fall over in the first decent storm. And the board has, I think, been very wise in letting us have our head a lot of the time. But I do want to acknowledge that as well as letting us have our head, the board has regularly provided extremely wise advice to all of us, and particularly to the head gardener, about where to plant and when to root up, and of course, when to prune judiciously. And I'd particularly like to thank on that score Glyn Davis, David Kemp and Ian Watt, the last two of whom are here today, for their advice on the content of any number of Grattan reports. They only ever provided advice in the spirit that it was my job to decide whether or not to take it. And usually I took it because it was very good advice. Occasionally I didn't take it, and almost invariably I regretted that later. I'd also like to acknowledge particularly the Council of Grattan's two chairs, Alan Myers and Alex Chernoff. They usually gave me my head. They occasionally, very wisely, told me that I should think again. And they resolutely and absolutely invariably backed Grattan whenever an external stakeholder made the foolish error of thinking that pressuring the board might help when they had failed to convince the staff of Grattan about the merits of their point of view. And of course, the board as a whole has been extremely generous in acknowledging that the success of Grattan is primarily the results of the extraordinary efforts of its extraordinary staff. Because after all, when you go to see a garden, you go to see the trees, not the owner. And so let me talk a little about staff. The staff at Grattan have been an extraordinary group of colleagues, friends and fellow travellers in the mission to improve Australia's government. Visitors, and indeed many people tonight, have often remarked about Grattan's culture, but what they're really seeing is the humanity of the people who work there. You all have that rare combination of figuring out the right answer much faster than the average bear, but also knowing you just might be wrong. And that's a very rare combination. And that intellectual honesty is, which Carmela's already mentioned, is at the heart of Grattan. And it's ultimately why people, politicians, public servants, journalists and the public trust us. Because we are honest with ourselves. We might be wrong, but at least we've been wrong in an honest way. Now, that trust, of course, has been somewhat back in fashion for the last couple of months as we've all dealt with the COVID crisis. Now, contrary to social media reports, I did not personally engineer the virus in a Chinese laboratory in order to demonstrate Grattan's flexibility. But the crisis has shown how Grattan can make an enormous contribution to both official and public thinking within weeks on a problem that, for obvious reasons, was not on the work plan at the beginning of 2020. And the results that Danny's spoken about in terms of the profile of Grattan through that crisis, I think we've had more profile than all other think tanks put together. Shows just how important that trust, which is a consequence of that honesty and intellectual integrity, is. A good tree, of course, does blow with the breeze, but it ultimately stands fast. And that's what you, as the Grattan staff, have all done. I'd particularly like to thank the Grattan program directors, past, present and by Zoom, for your support. Our weekly meetings have been an absolute pleasure. So to those who are still program directors, to Danny, to Brendan, to Tony, to Stephen, to Marion and to Pete, thank you. For those who have been Grattan program directors, particularly Jim, who's here tonight, thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. The weekly meetings we've had have been an absolute pleasure. As a result of your wisdom, I have the management decisions that went out in my name were invariably much better than the decisions I would have made by myself. You've all coped with my suggestions and my illegible handwriting with very good grace, and you've all taken the opportunity to drive Australian public policy to a better place. You, like all of the other Grattan staff, could have done many, many other things. You chose to come to Grattan. You gave up many things to do that because you believed in the institution and what it could do for the country. I'd also particularly like to thank those who've worked on the Australian Perspectives team, otherwise known as CEO's Pet Projects, over the years. You have indulged the Chief Executive's desire to do the fun stuff of writing the reports, primarily by writing them for me, and then tolerating my failure to work through them until very late in the piece, as Carmela has explained with detail that was perhaps just a little excessive. So particularly to Danny, to Brendan, to Carmela, to Emily, thank you for your patience in putting up with some of my less remarkable management features, but you have definitely provided many of my most enjoyable times at Grattan, both in working with you and then frankly being able to take the best of your work to the wider world and seeing it flourish. Now, another freedom I've had at Grattan has been to work at Grattan with two of the very, very best editors in the business. Unfortunately, these days, there's a belief that editing is something that you allow a sort of, 22-year-old communications graduate to do. And there is far too many people who have forgotten that the editor is the most senior person in a newspaper. And that's because good editing is an extremely hard-won skill. Now, James and Paul both share a fascination in football that I find completely incomprehensible. James has written a book about football, and I'm presuming with Paul that it's only a matter of time. But they also have the instincts of truly great pruners. They're prepared to take away a branch, no matter how pretty the acorns, if that's what the tree really needs. They do it with very good grace, but they're very firm. Both of them, in their own way, are artists who love beautiful writing. For them, of course, Grattan reports have a moral purpose, but they've also imposed an aesthetic just a little bit for its own sake in a world that needs just a little bit more beauty most of the time. So thank you for that. And thank you also because writing is a craft which one never stops learning, and it's been an extraordinary privilege to have my writing improved by you, James and Paul, over the last 11, I'm sorry, Paul, over the past 11 years. People often pontificate about the virtues of cross-disciplinary thinking. Grattan is one of the very few places I know where it's got people with science backgrounds, arts backgrounds, economic backgrounds, legal backgrounds, all working together to produce results very quickly that are much better than the sum of their parts. It's been a luxury to work with all of you from Grattan over the years, so many fascinating people from such varied backgrounds, every one of you bringing something different every time we thought about a topic. So an enormous thank you to all of you, the staff of Grattan, past, present and by Zoom, for making the last 11 years such a fulfilling role. You've done amazing work and you've made me look way more knowledgeable than I really am. Needs to put in more effort is never, ever something I have heard in a Grattan performance review. You've made Australia a better place, and you've been a fantastic group of people to play with, whether gathered around a whiteboard, in the tea room, around the tennis table, or even over Zoom. And then I want to say a thank you to the other stakeholders of Grattan, because we are ultimately only one institution in a much bigger tapestry. And those stakeholders include, first and foremost, at least in time, the University of Melbourne. And a big thank you to Duncan and, of course, your predecessor, Glyn Davis, for making Grattan. It would not be here without the university, and it certainly wouldn't have become what it is without the university. Not just for the material and resource support that the university provides, but because of the intellectual environment that we are part of. And we're acutely aware that we should be held to the highest standards, not necessarily every academic standard, and many of you have heard me talk about that, but to the best of academic standards, and that has been an important part of Grattan's success. And there's a lot of other stakeholders, academics from beyond the University of Melbourne and experts from beyond the University of Melbourne. We all know that we send our reports to them. We all know we get a lot of comments from them, and we all know that what goes out to the public is infinitely better as a result. There are a number of other stakeholders. There's all of the donors who are essentially keeping Grattan going. And without them, this whole enterprise wouldn't work. And then, of course, there's all of the other institutions that go to making Australian public policy in public service, in our political parties and so on. We are all acutely aware that we're part of that much bigger whole. So to the future. Now, of course, today isn't really a farewell. As Alex has pointed out, I'm not actually going yet. But, of course, it's the end of one point. I actually realised it's an abdication and a coronation. As those oak benches in the House of Commons very occasionally hear, the King is dead, long live the Queen. So the institution goes on a long way beyond me, and it's incredibly satisfying to have been the first head gardener for a tree with that kind of strength. And there is no one that I would rather have as the next head gardener than Danny. We've worked together for over 6 years. She is a brilliant economist, which is one description that I have not been entitled to. She's a compassionate colleague, except when looking for victory on the table tennis table, an extremely thorough manager, and really just a fantastic person to work with. Granton, frankly, should be so lucky. And I expect that Grattan is going to flourish under her leadership and that she will in turn hand on an even more magnificent tree. Because trees grow bigger than you and last a lot longer. Most of the trees we've planted near Kyneton are not going to grow to half size in my lifetime. I hope that's also going to be true of Grattan. One person can plant a lot of trees, but you usually only get to create an institution once in your life. Grattan has been that chance for me, and thank you to everyone here for being part of it.